Clone High, One-Shots, and Smut. JFK x Van Gogh. By Donuts68. Vincent sighed as he sat on his chair in the art room. He placed his backpack against the leg of the table and pulled out his art supplies, a toned spiral-bound notebook, a pack of 24 colored pencils, and a mechanical pencil. He gazed up on the board to see the theme for today. Love. How cheesy, he thought as he opened his sketchbook. He flipped through a few pages, looking for something that he could finish and pass off as love. He continued flipping through the pages until something caught his eyes. It was a portrait of the school jock, John F. Kennedy. It looked good. The colored pencils were nicely blended. The facial expression and body were spot on. Now that he thought about it, he can't remember why he had stopped drawing this. Must have been some sort of self-embarrassment. He couldn't use this for his project anyways. There's no way in hell he'd let the art teacher see this, especially because his art teacher often hung his work on the walls, and he did not want JFK seeing this. Hey, that's pretty good, Vincent. A small voice behind the red head made him jump and slam his book shut. He turned around to see Joan of Arc smiling. Oh, thank goodness, you scared me, Joan. He sighed in relief as Joan giggled. He wasn't really close to Joan, but she seemed to be the only person who went out of her way to talk to him, and she was never mean to him. That was a lot considering how much he got picked on at school for being soft-spoken and the bandage around his head. Sorry, she chuckled again, making him smile. Joan of Arc was a very beautiful girl, and if he wasn't gay, he'd definitely be on the top of his share life goals and be together forever list. That's a really nice picture, though. You should give it to him, she assured, reaching past him and opening his sketchbook. She looked at the portrait for a second, smiling at how well drawn it was. It was a picture of JFK with sweaty hair and his football gear on. The face wasn't completely finished, but the eyes were perfect. She was shocked at how accurate the slant was, as JFK's face was fairly asymmetrical. I don't think so, he chuckled nervously, scratching his head before closing the sketchbook again. The bell rang and Joan made her way to her seat. Vincent sighed and rested his chin on his palm, waiting for the teacher to start talking about their theme for today. Love. I'm sure many of you had felt it before, his teacher began, leaning against the whiteboard next to the word. However, today we will be... The teacher was interrupted by the door to the room opening and closing. Vincent turned to see JFK snaking his way to his seat. Mr. Kennedy, you're late, the teacher announced to the class. Any explanation why? Nope, he replied, pulling out his sketchbook and his pencils. The teacher shook his head in disapproval and carried on. Like I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, today's theme is love, and you will be drawing who you love, he explained. The redhead broke out in a cold sweat. He could hear Joan sort of let out a laugh. It could be a family member, a pet. You could draw somebody you're dating or a crush. The class began working as soon as the teacher stepped away from the front of the class and walked over to JFK. Your grade in this class is plummeting, Mr. Kennedy, he explained. It's just a art class, he explained, laying his head back again, his hands and leaning his chair back. Well, you need art class to graduate, so I recommend you get somebody to help you finish your assignments, he threatened. Yeah, who's gonna help me? He asked, rolling his eyes at the idea of a tutor for art class. The teacher scanned the room. Van Gogh, he thought. He was a prodigy, basically. He had a 104% in the class and always knew what he was doing. Van Gogh, he called out, allowing Van Gogh's own thoughts to come to fruition and causing the redhead to jump a bit. He turned to see his teacher standing by JFK. For whatever reason, JFK looked especially handsome today. His shirt was tight to his body, tight enough to see his well-built chest and arms. His eyes were dark brown and small, the slant making him look kind of caring. Yes, he replied, turning red when JFK looked over at him and scoffed. You're going to help make sure Mr. Kennedy finishes his work for this project. I recommend you boys find a time to get together and work on your portraits, he explained. Oh, but, Vincent gulped. Is there a problem with that, Mr. Van Goh? The teacher asked, the whole class now staring at Van Gogh. He looked over at Joan, who had a big smile on her face. He gave her a look of worry, but she simply nodded her head, and he sighed. No, I can't do that, he said timidly before turning back around to work on his assignment. Great. Now he had to go over to JFK's house. Just the thought of being with him made him hard and broke him out in a nervous sweat. What was he going to do? Eventually the bell rang for class, and everybody packed up their things. Van Gogh closed his sketchbook, mumbling a few cursed words under his breath. He heard a voice behind him. He slammed the sketchbook on his table and jumped. Whoa, chill out, man. Van Gogh looked up to see JFK, hovering over his seat with a smile. I'm sorry, he apologized, ducking his head to avoid contact while he stuffed his supplies in his bag. So you, want to go to my place after school? He asked, placing a hand on the desk and leaning against it. Sure. The smaller boy looked up, trying not to seem nervous as he smiled. Great. My car is, in the west side of the parking lot. I'll, meet you after school. He stood up and walked out of the class, leaving Van Gogh to stare up at the ceiling. He packed up his things and walked out of the classroom. The rest of the day was hard for Van Gogh. He tapped his foot through the last 2 periods of the school day, anxious about his afternoon with JFK. Van Gogh sat in class for a minute before packing away his things in his book bag. With a big, deep, calming breath, he glanced his way through and walked out of the room. He made his way to parking lot, watching his feet as he carried him out of the door and onto the concrete of the lot. He looked up and scanned the lot. His eyes locked on JFK's bright red car. Once he got a little closer, he saw JFK coming from another door. He stood still for a second, observing the brunette before continuing forward. He opened his trunk and his backpack before walking to his car and getting in. He looked at himself in the mirror a few times, licking his teeth, which made Vincent's stomach flutter. The sound of a honk made Van Gogh's eyes shoot open, though. Sorry, he called out to the car in front of him before turning around towards the football captain. Hey, Van Gogh, JFK waved to him, making Van Gogh blush. He slyly walked to his car and opened the passenger door. Without a word, the younger buckled his seatbelt and held his bow tight, sitting his gaze on the view out of the windshield in front. He sat there for a couple moments in silence before he heard the other chuckle. You, nervous? He teased. I know I'm the most popular boy at school, but I, don't bite, he assured. Vincent looked up at him and forced a smile. JFK seemed to ignore and turn on some music, which was Fine Line by Harry Styles. Who knew the president liked Harry Styles? Van Gogh stared at JFK's hand on the steering wheel. They were big, his hands almost completely covering the whole wheel. He had big arms, too, and broad, muscular shoulders. He started to get hard. His brain began to spew ideas of what he could do to him. Although he was quite anxious, he couldn't help but look over at the older several times during the car ride, admiring his strong jawline and attractive side profile. JFK caught a gaze and turned to look at him before smirking. You, see something you like? He joked. Vincent nearly had a heart attack. Before he could reply, they pulled up into the driveway, saving the redhead from having to make up some poor excuse. I don't know if my, dads are home, but they're, pretty cool. You don't have to worry, he assured. They got out of the car and walked in, Van Gogh's eyes glued to JFK's ass as they walked through to his bedroom. The room was nice, and it smelt good. especially for the room of a teenage athlete. JFK threw his backpack on his bed and kicked off his shoes. He took off his shirt immediately and tossed it in the bin. I don't like wearing shirts in my house. Hope you don't mind, he explained. The redhead felt like he was about to explode. JFK's body was so toned and his skin was so smooth. Are you gay? Homosexual? Very? JFK asked. What? Van Gogh blurted out. Well, I'm not dumb. Despite what people most say, I do have a brain, he assured. Vincent began to shiver. His anxiety kicked up a notch as he lowered his hand to cover his heart. Hey, it's all right, JFK assured. He walked over to the smaller boy, still shirtless. He pulled the other hand away to reveal a surprisingly impressive bowl. I'm bisexual, by the way. Yes, JFK, the former president, is bisexual. Van Gogh's stomach hit the fucking floor. He stood still as JFK placed a hand over it, giving it an experimental squeeze that made Van Gogh secretly moan. What are you packing here, fella? He asked, dragging the zipper of his pants down to reveal boxers that were already damp with a little pre-splooge. JFK looked at Van Gogh, waiting for a response, but the redhead sat there silently. Let's get a little more comfortable, he suggested. That all right? Van Gogh mustered up enough to nod and join JFK on his bed. He looked amazing. Definitely the peak of high school athleticism. You have a nice body, Kennedy, he explained as he dragged his finger down JFK's chest, stopping at a nipple to tug on it. JFK let out a groan and bit his lip. Can I kiss you? JFK asked. The younger boy didn't answer. He shifted to his knees and pushed JFK on his back and kissed him. He kept playing with his nipples, tugging on them while pushing his tongue down his throat. JFK pulled at the hem of his pants. They slid off with ease, though, as they were already unzipped from earlier. He pulled down his underwear to reveal Van Gogh's member. A small bunch of curly red hairs sat at the base of his shaft, but it didn't distract from the size. Jesus Christ, man, this is huge, JFK commented, chuckling a bit. Van Gogh, again, remained silent. He sat between JFK's legs and plump his shaft. He drew his finger over the brunette's khakis lightly before unbuttoning them and pulling them down. You look beautiful, Van Gogh said softly, leaning down to kiss his abs. What? JFK asked, not seeming to take the compliment. I said you looked beautiful, he repeated, his eyes looking to JFK, a nervous smile on his face as he continued to trick himself. Pretty little slut, he said under his breath, but loud enough for JFK to hear. JFK's face flushed red, and his cock jumped. Vincent's shy and timidness melted as he quickly sat against the foot of the bed. Flip over, he demanded, watching as the brunette scrambled to obey his orders. He pulled down the other's pants and boxers in one tug, revealing JFK's perfectly perky ass, his cock hot and heavy as it dangled. Van Gogh, without much thought, left a firm smack against the tan skin. Fuck, he heard JFK whine. Quiet whore. He laid down another smack. Although firm, Vincent's member jumped at the jiggle of the brunette's bottom. Have you ever bottomed before? He asked, spreading his cheeks apart. He was surprised to see a shaved hole, as JFK's body was usually covered in hair. His ass was an exception. I messed around myself a little, he said unsurely. I don't really know how to do this thing, he admitted. Vincent noticed the timidness in his voice and let go of the handfuls of perfectly plump, bounced that ass that he was holding. Do you want to top? He asked, sliding down to lay down next to Jack. His face was bright red, and for the first time he saw the most popular boy at his school fluster, ashamed. Well, I could. If you want, he replied. Vincent could tell he was trying his best to sound truthful, but he saw the neediness in his eyes, a want to be dominated and taken care of, yet the look was nearly masked by the unsure expression on the order's face. "I'll go slow," Vincent assured, smiling when Jack nodded his head. The brunette slowly slid from his hands and knees to laying his stomach flat on the bed. "Are you nervous?" JFK chuckled awkwardly as Vincent stood up. "Let's not forget who made the first move," he teased. "I was too busy analyzing," Vincent lied through his teeth, but honestly, he fantasized about coitus with this dumb twunk jonkie nearly every night since his freshman year. "Are you nervous?" he asked. This was the big part. This is what makes or break any tension that Vincent had been craving since they met in 9th grade. The redhead reached for the hems of his shirt and pulled it over his head, pulling off to reveal his milky white skin, littered with bright red freckles. His skinny frame embarrassed him, and he tried best not to get red. Violent, bumpy raised scars covered his arms from his mid-biceps to his shoulder. They were clearly old and were faded, but he knew the skin was bumpy and rough. Jack didn't seem to mind at all. He was staring at a masterpiece. The red freckles that covered Vincent's body looked like a galaxy to the older man. Seeing the positive reaction from JFK gave the redhead the courage that he had previously held. He walked back over to the bed and laid on top of Kennedy, putting his body weight on the larger. He hugged him, kissing his neck softly before shifting his hands to hover over Jack. "You're a real masterpiece, Vinny," he said, looking out to Vincent's bright eyes. Without a word, the younger went back to kissing, this time working his way from his throat to his mouth. He slid his tongues past those perfect pink lips and licked his teeth. Cleo and Joan were right. Jack was an amazing kisser. The older sucked and prodded Vincent's mouth with skill that made the shorter feel like an amateur. I mean, he sort of was. It's not like he was fucking the whole school like JFK had. He pulled away, and the bottom whined. "Kiss me, Vincent," JFK trembled, watching as Vincent sat up and looked down at his body. "I just did, silly goofball," he replied, again on JFK's perky nipple. The brunette bit his lips, hiding his face with his sans as he arched his back. "So needy," the younger commented. "What am I gonna do with you?" So JFK's face was bright red and hot beneath his hands, trying to calm down as he felt Vincent shift a bit. Suddenly, Jack's legs were over the redhead's shoulders. He pulled away to see in between his legs, his lips dangerously close to Jack's hole, so close that the smaller's hot breath against it sent a chill down his spine. "Wait," JFK moaned, but it was not heard. Vincent licked a long strip of Jack's hole. He quickly dipped down again and pushed his tongue into the inner right ring of muscle. Jack tried not to crush Vincent's head with his thighs. He quivered and shaked as the redhead sloppily ate him out, skillfully, so he might add. How do you, get so good at this?" JFK could barely keep his eyes open because the pleasure pushed his pupil back to the back of his head. "Practice," he said quick before going back to fucking JFK with his tongue. He licked up to his balls and started to suck, moving his hands. The scoop of spit was left on his hole. He gathered it up with his fingers and slowly began to dip his fingers in, pressing past the tight ring of muscle and completely singling the digit into the older. He licked up the base of JFK's member and felt him shiver. "I feel like I'm gonna, the brunette mumbled, trying his best to hold back as the redhead swallowed around him. He tried to buck up, but Vincent immediately pulled him away, making JFK whine. "You can't climax yet. I've only put one finger in," he explained, wiggling the inside of JFK's tight wall, making him arch his back. "You look like a needy little slut right now. Arch your back like a desperate whore." You think you could become president? He asked. The older chuckled softly, biting his lip, reaching down for his pole. Vincent quickly slapped his hand away. Hey, he snapped at him. Gah! JFK let out a sound of disappointment. You're so whiny. Maybe you just told me what you want, the redhead teased. I want you to fuck me, he yelled. The president pushed Vincent back, causing his fingers to come out. Now, JFK was fairly big. He was about 6 foot and a good 190 pounds of pure muscle. So when he jumped on the top of this small, bony redhead, pinning his pale hands over his head and grinning from ear to ear, Vincent let out a squeak. What? Vincent asked. His stomach turned from how horny JFK's tight grip made him. You're, taking a little too long, he explained. He took a hand off Vincent's delicate wrist and spat on it, rubbing it all over his fingers before reaching behind him. He put 2 fingers and groaned at the burn. He started at a fast pace, a pace that Vincent could definitely tell was hurting. Then, with little to no warning, JFK grabbed the sealer's member and lined up his hole and slid down on it completely. He let out an animalistic growl and tried to start riding him. All he could see was pain on the older's face. It didn't seem like he was enjoying it as he went deeper in on the shaft. What are you doing? He asked, trying not to come from the tightness around his meaty flesh. God damn, JFK felt so tight. We're, having relations, JFK said between deep breaths, a glaze of sweat over his body. Do you like it? Not if you are hurting. Vincent looked directly into JFK's eyes. Does it hurt? JFK looks like he doesn't know how to answer the question. Vincent's meaty pull is completely hurried in his hole, and it felt like it was tearing him apart. I don't want to hurt you. JFK smiled, an evil smile almost. It made Vincent shiver, made him feel weak. I like it rough, Vinny, he explained. I know you want to be soft with me, but I'm not some soft pansy. He set the pace, fast, and Vincent choked. The tight rubbing and pace made him climax in minutes. Then, when they finally caught their best, JFK dipped down to clean all the splooge off, licking and swallowing like some street whore. Very unlikely for a president. Vincent felt like he could bust again from the sight, but he was just too tired to keep going. The two slept together in contentful bliss as they lie in their lust. The end.